Hello and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Riffe Gallery. Today we're going to have a look at On the Grid, curated by Kelly Dietrick. So Kelly, you took a lot of time to think about what you would put forward as a curatorial proposal. And On the Grid is what you came up with, but there's some nuance there that I'd love for you to chat about. Tell us about this exhibition.
Yes, the exhibition is utilizing the grid as a starting point to organize what I hope is a really wide variety of work and a variety of disciplines around the grid as either a foundational design element or as a motif, or in some cases something that doesn't even feel prominent in the work but is present as just a sort of note.
Wonderful. So let's take a moment, and another thing that you mentioned to me earlier that I really enjoy, and I think our audience will enjoy, is the importance of relationship in artwork. So when you put forward how you would like this exhibition to be laid out, it was a lot about relationship.
It is.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think of the grid as a foundational element for the exhibition and curating it in so much as thinking about artists sort of crossing paths, moving in different directions, whether in terms of materials or concepts or missions, what the end goal is. Some of the artists are working in product design and some are really committed to painting as a practice. So bringing artists together from different points in their career too is an interesting thing for me. So yeah, I think just trying to use that as a way to think about making connections and thinking about intersections where paths are being crossed.
I love that. So let's start having a look at the artists. Tell us about this one.
This is Ilenia Pezzaniti. She's based in Akron, and this is an artist that I've worked with before. Her work is, I think, very project-based, so there's a lot of variety. I think of her as being pretty prolific. She does work as a documentarian in communities, but also has this great eye for nuance and just seeing things, which, you know, I'm one of those people too that I'm not a photographer, but just seeing things in the world that make you stop and see the texture or the color or the relationships. And so these ones I think have that visual appeal, but there's also this sort of conceptual sense of, I don't know, sort of things being abandoned or sort of undone that I think is really interesting. So in these, obviously, the approach of the grid, and she's not someone who is thinking a ton about the grid, I don't think, as something conceptual in her work, though often because she's working in terms of projects, they'll be organized in a grid or a sense of multiples or a collection of things, which I do think relates to the grid some way. So yeah, these pieces sort of appealed to the sense of the grid pretty literally, I think.
Yeah, and that has a really natural kind of pull to our next artist. So this, you know, you're seeing windows, right? And that's a portion of it, but tell me a little bit more about the relationship between these two.
Yeah, so this is Adam Goldberg, who has been based in Toledo, and he was the owner and operator of Gathered Glass. I think he's moving on to explore some new exciting things, but I think this work is so appealing to our tactile senses. It's quite literal in its use of the grid again, but certainly that feels sort of like the subject of it. So thinking about these cubic units and material contrasts, and certainly giving us the material quality of the actual windows here. But I think in Ilenia's work and in Adam's work, there is sort of a contrast of textures. So fiberglass with something soft and fluffy, or, you know, the different textures that we get on there. We get matte and sort of rough and glossy and shiny.
Yeah, and that's a really natural flow to our artist over here.
Yeah, this is David Kruk. David is an artist that I've just started to sort of get to know, and I love his work. I think it's really fun. I think that what he's doing feels like a really authentic commitment to exploring art making, right? It feels always like it's very much about art as a practice. This one I love, obviously, the use of the grid sort of broken up and moved around, so it's really dynamic, but I think the relationships of, the plywood to the spongy material relates to me to the like soft tubes and round elements. Sort of refers back to Ilenia's piece too. I see those connections of like curvilinear with the grid and a playing of textures.
Absolutely. And the other piece that David has in this show has a really clear connection to the grid. It's just over here.
Yeah, so this piece, I think it's by David Kruk, and he's currently based in Kent. It's ceramic, but certainly presents as a painting, is very graphic and sort of has this parallel projection approach to a grid so that it spatially becomes very dynamic. And I tend to I love, again, the contrast of textures here. It feels sort of tactile to me. I love the sort of slight curve of it. It feels really object-like, which again relates to his other piece. I think they're really visually different, but have a lot of similarities that I think are lovely.
It's also, it pulls me into nostalgia with the Cubert.
Yeah, yes. Well, and he's even like been doing things like game design and stuff like that.
Oh,
so,
wow, nice.
It's like from found materials to digital work as well. This is work by Gina Osterloh, who I'm really delighted and honored to get to work with, and I've just gotten to know her work and her more with this project. So that's been really great for me as a curator and an artist myself. I get to learn so much from people. So when I talk to her about her work, I think it's important to note these feel like really graphic drawings, right? They feel like a handmade mark on paper, but they're actually photographs of drawings, and they're at about a 1-to-1 scale, so we have a sense of the body's relationship to it. Her work is very much built around performance, and she thinks of drawing as performance, but in some of her other work, she also uses herself as the subject. So she would be sort of in a room like that, and sort of many times camouflaging the boundaries of her body and within the boundaries of the room. And I think these feel sort of like they're blurring our sense of the body by magnifying it. So zooming in and getting really intimate somehow also blurs them or makes them a little bit abstract.
Wonderful.
And I think too, it's notable, one of the relationships I like in this show that just sort of happened, but I like thinking about, these have this very thoughtful frame around them, within the frame. So there's that, they're in that box within the square. And Marc Ross's work also does that, and those are little things to notice that I enjoy.
It's the artist's hand and paying attention.
Yeah, and she is very much using her identity as a Filipino-American and thinking about sense of self and identity and how you're seen.
Yeah, wonderful. And so when we talk about sense of self, that really directly correlates with a couple of pieces that we have over here. Maybe we'll start with Lindsay if you wanted to.
Yeah, Lindsay Martin Gryskewich is a painter. I like to use the word painterly with her work. I think that I'm always really drawn to it. I think the color is really beautiful. I love, to me, that they seem somehow so accurate, even though they're shifting and bending and not like representational in a really traditional way, but they seem like sort of accurate depictions of a memory or memories, moments. Her work is really driven by sort of domestic, personal, autobiographical scenes that build up as sort of your own personal context. Her work, again, I don't know that she's an artist who is really thinking about the grid conceptually in her work, but because she is interested in color and pattern and how those can shift and bend space, we get the grid quite naturally because it's a really common pattern in our world. I remember very clearly my grandmother's grid floor and thinking about pattern.
And that has a really lovely flow and dovetail into Heather's work, right?
Yes, yeah, which I think it's sort of in contrast in that Lindsay's work feels very painterly and sort of loose, and this feels like hard edge, really graphic work from afar, but when you get closer there's a softness to it because it's actually not a paint. Well, it is a painting, but it's made of fabric, so it's referencing Appalachian quilt history and thinking about feminine roles and practices and that sort of craft. Again, I'm really drawn to the geometry and the color of these, and then sort of the way that using a grid as thinking about interdisciplinary work, or people that are thinking about intersections of painting and sculpture, or painting and quilting, craft and fine art. I like those intersections.
All right. So shall we go around the corner here and we have kind of an Easter egg as we come around the corner
Oh,
here.
yes. Yeah.
One of the artists has created a self-portrait. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think the self is something that comes up in a lot of this work, and I really love the way that portraiture is one of the things that is dealt with in really different ways across the show. This is by Seth Nagelberg, and his work always seems really playful and sort of clever, but also really refined and embracing simple things that create some sort of complexity. So I love that this is the profile of Seth's face, and then it ends up creating this tessellating geometric pattern. There's just an interesting approach, I think, to using the self as a subject.
Absolutely. There's a little math involved there.
Yes, yeah.
And also a really lovely transition, both from portrait, but also that kind of mathematic approach into our next artist.
This is work by Melissa English Campbell, and she is very much a textile artist, but I think my feeling about it is that it's also very much mingling with painting. She does, so the warp and the weft, there's painting before it gets woven, so things shift. I think that in her work there's always this sort of sense of movement or concealing and revealing that is sort of shifting back and forth. Her work generally is, she does a lot of portraiture, but not always. Sometimes it's more abstract. I think she's, even in these, which seem clearly like portraits, she's still exploring the abstract and pattern and just the process of weaving and tension. So she talks a lot about tension in her work because that's part of the weaving process, but I think she's also creating tension in the work. There's always a sort of blurring of the subject, or it feels like sort of like a moire of kinds where you feel like you can kind of see it but not entirely. Mm-hmm.
That soft kind of pillowing too.
Yes, and certainly the texture of it is nice.
So I think there's just a brilliant kind of sequence that we have from Seth to Melissa to Robert, both in color but also in the visual texture that comes through.
I also really love that on this wall in this particular installation, I love the sort of pillowy texture of Melissa's work in contrast to Robert's unframed, really flat images. But I think one of the things I loved about this is purely visual. I just love the color together. So, and the texture. So, the sort of striations that are in there, we get in this piece. So I just think it's a really lovely combination of things. They're both thinking about portraiture, but Robert Banks is doing so in a very different way. I think his portraiture, to me, feels sort of, he's just a master of the craft and so interested in photography as a practice and practicing it, doing it over and over. So he does these sessions with models, but he's also a filmmaker, so I think you can obviously see the direction going on. So they kind of feel like clips from a film, or like you have a sense of, they kind of feel a little bit fashion, there's definitely a style to them. And I picked this, they happen to have grids in them, and I'm interested in his work. So it was, in some ways, the grid is a way to include a wide variety of art, because it can be a visual way to unify it.
Yeah. Beautifully composed.
This is work by Molly Fitzpatrick, who is an artist that I always loved her work as a designer. As she's the founder of Ditto House, and I had stumbled on that years ago. And then you get to realize that there's a person behind that. So I've recently gotten to know her, and she is doing a lot more work sort of under the umbrella of artist, but also product design for interiors. And she's really on a mission to bring joy to our everyday life through color and pattern. And I love that she talks about, as I'm here talking about work, she talks about art being, and design being approachable so that you don't have to bring something to it. You can just enjoy it for the color and the texture and the shape. I am, I love color theory, so I love, how a single color can change as it passes through another color. So that visual mixing to me, the red seems totally different here than it does here.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
This is her other work. I would say behind Molly's work, we see this really joyous, colorful, bold work, but behind her work is a real commitment to being socially responsible as an artist. So she does research on anything that she gets produced to make sure that she feels like it matches her values. So these were woven on backstrap looms by a women's cooperative in Guatemala. That helps support them, and they name the price. It's all, so she, I know this project is special to her. And this was one of the first pieces I saw when I discovered her work. So to me, it's like representative. So there have been more of these in the series, but this is 9 of them. And I love that the color shifts. So just changing the color from yellow to blue puts one circle in front of the black bars and one circle behind it. So you get that spatial shifting that is pretty delightful.
So in this kind of area of the gallery, you were really intentional about that visual repetition. Mm-hmm. You have the motif of the circle or quasi-circle mm-hmm. really central here with Molly's work, another couple of pieces by Seth, into Catherine's work. So can you talk a little bit about how you saw that, especially since we've seen one piece by Seth, but maybe that kind of relationship and the importance of placing them where you have?
Yeah. I think, for one thing, I love that, Molly's work is just so rooted in weaving, and Seth's work is just really rooted in ceramics. And what can happen with that. But this sort of repetition that happens here, so instead of a circle or square grids, we get a sort of isometric grid. And it varies in height, and it looks so geometric and so solid. But it's actually referencing basalt columns. And so I think that's a lovely, he talks a lot about using nature as a way to think about how to make something or how to build something. And I think that's a theme that comes up with other artists as well. And of course, these are just really, really lovely and punchy in terms of color, along with some of the work we've just seen.
Absolutely. So we have another piece by Molly that really nicely kind of encaps.
Yeah. In this piece, I believe both these, the first and this piece, are pieces that she wove on a loom. The ones in the middle were the ones that she collaborated on.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Catherine's work here.
Yeah, and moving from this piece of Molly's, which is so obviously about the grid and intersections, this work by Catherine, she often uses stripes to tip and tilt and move space. But in this one, I love that it's really linear, actually, because it helps to, emphasize that the use of the grid is really about units. And so this opportunity to create units and explore repetition and just try things different ways, I think is really something that tends to be exciting for artists. So I love this work, and I think it's really lovely with the other pieces.
Right. So perhaps, let's pop over to Noel's work here.
Yeah, this is work that I've been thinking a lot about because it's really conceptually kind of dense, I think. Noel uses their heritage as a Palestinian American to drive the work and to sort of reconnect with a place that maybe seems sometimes lost or out of touch. I think the use of the beeswax to me is really interesting because I think that they're talking about things that are present, things that are lost, and this idea that beeswax can evaporate or be displaced and change, or also just sort of remain the same, I think is interesting. So thinking about displacement and change. Noel also thinks about the burning of these as part of a performance. So like Gina, they use performance as an element of their work. So these would sometimes be burned in a gallery space, but there's evidence of burning on some of the pieces in here. I think the candle sort of feels like a sort of reference to hope, but also it's demonstrating some destruction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now these pieces on the floor are relatively hard to see, but that's also kind of an important piece of it, right?
Yeah.
This disappearing.
Yeah. The work that they did recently in a show was so beautiful in terms of light and shadow, and there's a softness and a beauty to it, even though I think it's talking about some really hard personal things. So I appreciate that. But yeah, this idea of elevating and floating them to create the shadows on the floor, I think is really adds some complexity. And I think it's also about layers, right? So like this building of things. And I think what I just totally forgot to talk about, which is important, is that these patterns, these little grids, are sort of references to trees, which is a traditional Palestinian embroidery, which is something that's passed down from generation to generation. And so that sort of idea of familial heritage and something remaining and getting shared is really important.
Lovely. And so just across the way, we have Emily, who has some sculptural works.
Yes, this is work by Emily Sullivan Smith. Her work always feels like meditations on nature or humans' impact on nature. And it's always really beautiful. Similar to Noel's, I think there's this sense of beauty as they approach things that are sort of destructive or have a sort of impact that we can see happening ahead of us. They're always very labor intensive. The spider webs are beaded together, so very labor intense work. And I think that they really serve as surrogates for something that we might not have in the future. And Emily's titles talk about that as well.
Yeah.
But she has this really great relationship to nature where you get the sense that she's always sort of 100% present in her environment and thinking about all of it. I think many of us go through life not noticing a lot of things. And
yeah, these are noticing, for
yes,
sure.
Yes,
For sure.
And I have to say, this white piece with the white web is just really incredible in person.
And there's something you had mentioned earlier about the exiting of color from the stump and from the stones. That's, that also kind of references this potential like exiting, whiting out, erasing.
Yeah, and it also feels like this signal that it's not real, that it is a surrogate and a stand-in, and it feels reproduced. So I think, that's one of my reads on it, but it also feels, sort of like it lightens it, quite literally somehow, conceptually. But my first, these pieces kind of made me gasp when I first saw them. They have something really powerful about them.
So you did another really kind of phenomenal pairing in this area with multiple pieces, but particularly from this piece to Peter's. Can you talk a little bit about why it was so important for them to be next to each other, what that does for a viewer, how we're to navigate this space, and maybe bring up some chewy conversation?
Yeah. I think Peter's work is very much about the built world, which Emily's work is talking about the impact of the built world and humans on the natural environment. They both, I think, have this sense of fragility to them. Obviously the white, the use of that all over white on that foundational element is interesting. And then to me, when I was thinking about artists, I first was thinking about artists that use the grid. And then when I was, there's just an obvious visual relationship that's quite lovely about the sort of languishing spider web and this sort of dripping, drooping element that is in contrast to the grid here and the structure. So there's a sense of like collapse and two things that maybe don't go together interacting.
It's such a satisfying pairing to like come from one to the next and be, visually comprehend like, oh, I understand. Like they are not the same, but they have bass notes. Yeah.
And I think that there's a sort of solemnness to both of them. I don't know that Peter Johnson would use that to describe his work, but as a viewer or someone looking for connections, it feels like, in his practice, he puts all of this work into meticulously building these things and then invites them to collapse, which creating opportunities for vulnerability and change. And destruction, but I think that there's a sort of quietness and solemnness to both Emily's work and Peter Johnson's work.
I also love how this one so clearly references the grid, but then he modifies it to be more organic, to have a flow to it, to bend it outside of our static idea of straight and narrow.
Yeah. I think this too, it feels kind of like that grid that gets like spider webbed and sort of we get angles and drooping and movement from it. This references that, and it feels like maybe it was a circle, but then it gets changed. But it also feels really architectural, and it's got this sort of curve that, again, this Peter Christian Johnson's work and Robert Banks's work, totally different in terms of practice, but I think visually, I loved this sort of sense of the grid as a structural element in our built world, so as fencing or as bridge architectural elements. And so I think that there's this relationship there between sort of referencing architecture or using that as a subject. So Robert is using that as a subject and a context for this work. And I love everything about these in terms of just playing with pattern and the black and white and really emphasizing the grid on the what she's wearing, but also behind her. So yes, I thought this was to me it can be kind of fun to have a way to put two artists together that,
disparate
maybe don't seem like they would belong their practice is so different.
Sure. And so you have another really gorgeous pairing here. Can you chat a bit about Barbara?
Yeah, Barbara Bryn Klare is an artist that one of the things I really love about this work is the use of modest materials, so ordinary things, and I love the scale of it, so it feels really intimate and sort of delicate. So literally weaving together lines to create something that feels sort of tactile and dimensional. She also uses found bits of scrap in her work and sort of found bits of things. And I think the color is very luminous. Like, here it's a little bit darker, but we've got that little strip of turquoise and red at the top that feels like a nice surprise. And this has a similar luminous quality to Marc's work. But Barbara Bryn Klare also, I think, thinks about the artist as someone who has social responsibility. So even though her work tends to be sort of abstract and not full of that kind of symbolism, it's something that's really important in driving her as an artist. This is work by Marc Ross. I think it has a really beautiful similarity of luminosity, and it's it's got the same sort of striations, but on a totally different scale. And it does the thing, I think maybe the first artwork that I ever had a sort of visceral response to was a Marc Rothko piece at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I thought, oh, something just happened, right? And I think this has that similar sort of, it creates a sort of environment or fuzziness that makes you sort of respond to it as a whole body. And I think that's partly the scale.
Yeah.
They feel quite grand. But then when you get in, it's just these really delicate, it's made of, sort of the same quality of line as we get here. It's just so much larger and very layered.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to dovetail into that, the amount of marks that happen, pun intended, right?
Yeah.
As you are contemplating these works and engaging with them, they vibrate, visually they vibrate for you, and they give you the gift, right, as you look longer.
Yeah, oh yes. I mean, I think that, when you first see it, it feels like some squares, some sort of nested squares, right? But then upon like closer interaction, there's these really subtle red bands that go across it. And that's just really beautifully layered. And I also love that it's this large, grand painting, but it feels like drawing too. The hand is definitely very present.
Yeah. Yeah, I love imagining him actually making those marks.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. What a treat to end on these pieces. So this has been an overview of On the Grid, an exhibition curated by Kelly Dietrick. A big thank you for your time and talent in putting this together. It's been phenomenal, as well as to the artists that participated in this exhibition. Big thank you to the governor, the legislature, and the Ohio Arts Council's board, who support the arts in Ohio, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists.